In this video, we're going to go through how the war began, what the war was like for soldiers, a little bit of what the war was like for people living at home, and make sure that you're answering the multiple choice questions as we go through the video so that you get credit for completing this assignment. And we're going to begin with Germany having to figure out how to defend both against France and Russia. And this is called fighting on two fronts because think about the sandwiching, there's two different enemies on either side of Germany. And so in an effort to avoid having to fight both of them at the same time, Germany had the Schlieffen Plan, which was beat Paris, or France, before Russia could mobilize their soldiers. Because remember, the Russian military is really big, but also it's mostly reservist, so there's a long time between when Russia starts to mobilize their soldiers and when Russia's actually ready to attack. And so Germany had the plan, which was just take over France before Russia can actually get their soldiers ready to go. The von Schlieffen called it Paris for lunch and dinner in St. Petersburg. And because Germany had captured Paris before, in the Franco-Prussian War, their plan was basically just repeat the success that they had had then, and then turn the soldiers to defend on the Eastern Front against Russia. And German intelligence had estimated that it would take Russia about 6 weeks to actually be ready for war, which means that Germany has a month and a half to defeat France. And their plan wasn't to necessarily attack France through the Alsace-Lorraine region, which is where the Franco-Prussian War was fought, but to attack France from the north through Belgium, which was less defended for war. And so the idea was that if they attacked France in a part where France wasn't expecting to be attacked, they'd be able to conquer France in that 6 weeks and then turn their soldiers to Russia. Well, Belgium, who's a pretty significant territory in the Schlieffen Plan, had announced just before Russia started mobilizing their military, Belgium had announced to the world that they would really like to stay neutral, that they didn't want to have any part in this conflict, and if everyone could just leave them alone, that would be great. And so on August 2nd, Germany sends Belgium a letter that basically says, well, you've got a difficult choice to make. You can either let us use your roads and bridges and trains and whatnot to move our military through your country so that we can attack France, or we can just attack you. And Belgium decides that rather than let Germany use their country as a highway for their war with France, Belgium would blow up their bridges and get ready to defend themselves against Germany. So on August 4th, Germany invades Belgium and starts to try to move their military through Belgium towards France. Part of the reason that Belgium decided to fight as opposed to just give in to Germany, which has the strongest military in all of Europe, was because Belgium had a powerful ally, or actually several powerful allies, from this almost 70-year-old treaty called the Treaty of London. In 1839, when Belgium was a newly formed country, they had an agreement with Austria, France, a bunch of German-speaking countries, the Netherlands, Russia, and Britain, to maintain Belgium's neutrality. And so if any country threatened Belgium through invasion or tried to conquer them, all of these countries who've signed this Treaty of London are supposed to come to the defense of Belgium. And so in 1914, when Germany invades, Belgium sends a letter to the British government saying, hey, we're being invaded, and do you remember 70 years ago when you signed that thing that said you'd come defend us if we got invaded? It's time. And that debate, or that letter to Britain, started a debate in the British government where some politicians felt like it was their obligation to uphold this decades-old treaty and to send military aid to support Belgium. And other politicians said that they weren't the ones who agreed to this treaty and it hadn't been upheld over time, and so they had no responsibility to get involved in this European war. And then we start to see a lot of propaganda, like the picture that we have on this slide here, trying to push British public opinion into supporting British involvement in the war. And eventually, that public opinion shifts so hard that the British politicians do agree to send military aid to Belgium and officially enter World War I. So here's our first our multiple choice question. It's just to check to make sure that you're understanding. What brought Britain into World War I? We're starting off real easy. Go ahead and answer this question, and I'll see you on the other side of it. Which, if I figured this out right, is the other side's right here. Okay, so the correct answer here is of course D, that when Germany invades Belgium on August 4th, Britain agrees to send in soldiers to defend Belgium, enacting their agreement on the Treaty of London. And so we see the alliances, now that the conflict has actually begun, transform in their name. The Triple Alliance becomes the Central Powers, in part because they're centrally located in Europe. You see where Germany and Austria-Hungary are. And then also because Italy ends up deciding that they don't really want to be a part of any of this, and so they leave the alliance that they had had with Germany and Austria before the war. Italy makes an agreement with France that Italy's just going to stay out of the war as long as France promises not to attack them, and so it's just Germany and Austria at the start, and then the Ottoman Empire, who is not excited about Russia gaining any more land or power in the region, joins Austria-Hungary and Germany and become the Central Powers. The advantages of the Central Powers is first that they're centrally located, so that means that if they need to move supplies from Prussia all the way down to where the Austro-Hungarian army is invading Serbia, they can without having to go through enemy lines. They also have the largest army in Europe, thanks to Germany, and the most industrial capacity because of, again, of Germany. So not only are they able to have a lot of soldiers, they can outfit those soldiers with a wide array of weaponry. On the other side of the fight, we have the Allies, which formerly were called the Triple Entente. There are a lot of allies, some of which are listed here, and the ones in bold are our most significant. So we've got Russia and Britain, and then France, and then very much so towards the end of the war, the US. The Allies have the advantage of the world's largest navy, thanks to Britain. They also have access to the most people through Russia, so theoretically they could have the largest army if they could get all of those people outfitted for war. And because of France and Britain and their colonial conquest throughout the 1800s, they also have access to a lot of raw materials through their colonies, and they have the strategic advantage of a two-front war, as long as they can slow down the German army from conquering France long enough that Russia can get ready for war. And that's exactly what we see happen with the Battle of the Marne. So starting in September 7th, for 5 days, the Allies and the Central Powers fight. And both sides had gone into this war in August thinking that it was going to be a really quick war. But after the Battle of the Marne, there were some signs showing that this war was actually going to take quite a lot of time and have a really high casualty rate. We see the 300,000 dead or wounded in these 5 days is twice as many casualties as we have in the entire Russo-Japanese War. And in part of that, it's because both sides are so evenly matched that when they send their soldiers to attack, instead of one side pushing and winning, they're both so evenly matched that neither side gains ground, falling into what's called a stalemate. And this stalemate on the Western Front slows Germany down long enough that they have to start preparing to defend against Russia without having conquered France first. As the months pass on, the war slows down and starts to drag on, and both sides thought that the war would be over. Many of the soldiers who enlisted back in August thought that they would be home for Christmas, and by December it's pretty clear that nobody's going to be winning anytime soon. And so we see on December 25th, 1914, something pretty unique happen on the front in France. And so here we have Captain Robert Patrick talking about his experience on Christmas Day in 1914, where he says, "We're having the most extraordinary Christmas Day imaginable. A sort of unarranged and quite unauthorized, but perfectly understood and carefully observed truce exists between us and our friends at the front. The thing started last night, a bitter cold night with white frost, soon after dusk when the Germans started shouting, 'Merry Christmas, Englishmen,' to us. Of course, our fellows shouted back, and presently large numbers of both sides have left their trenches, unarmed, and met in the debatable, shot-riddled no-man's land between the lines. Here the agreement, all of their own, came to be made that we should not fire at each other until after midnight tonight. The men were all fraternizing in the middle. Naturally, we did not allow them too close to our line, and swapped cigarettes and lies in the utmost fellowship. Not a shot was fired all night." If you want to pause here and go Google the Christmas truce, there's a lot of really wonderful videos describing what happened. But basically, both sides along the Western Front are trenches filled with, 18 to 20-year-old boys away from home for the first time during Christmas, and they're feeling homesick and lonely. And when they hear, the enemy combatants singing Christmas songs rather than firing at them, they join in. And all across the Western Front, there's instances of soldiers disobeying direct orders to fire and instead getting out and meeting in the no man's land between the two trenches and playing games of soccer and giving each other haircuts and trading parts of their uniforms or photos of their family or trinkets. It's really quite miraculous. And it only happens in 1914. While there are going to be 3 more Christmases during World War I, by 1915, the soldiers don't stop to recognize that the people on the other side of the trench are just like them. Not where they want to be on Christmas. So, the Christmas truce is evidence that best supports which of the following 3 claims. I think that the correct answer that we're looking for here is B, that the fighting stopped because soldiers recognized they had something in common with each other. While C is a true statement, it doesn't necessarily connect to the Christmas truce or why they would stop fighting, and A is just a false fact. It's not true. Don't think it's a religious war. So that takes us to what were the trenches actually like. And the first thing we need to tackle is why did they start using trenches? And when we see the new industrialized machinery of World War I used in battles in France, machine guns proved to be like a real big problem that you have to solve. And how do you dodge machine gun fire? You dig down into the ground to create defenses. And so head-on attacks were not effective against these newly industrialized weapons, and so soldiers had to dig in. And they didn't dig straight lines. Because if you've ever played a first-person shooter like Call of Duty, you can imagine why a hallway wouldn't be a particularly effective map. So in the trenches, they dig them in these zigzag patterns, not only for their defense, but also to confuse their enemies when they come in. And if you look at the gap between the 2 squiggly lines here, we see no man's land, which is the land they're fighting over as soldiers from one side try to push into the trenches of soldiers on the other side. To prevent soldiers from doing exactly that, pushing into your enemy trench, you would line your trench with barbed wire, which became a huge problem in gaining land in World War I, as getting through an enemy's barbed wire was difficult. It took time, and that time was enough for your enemies to defend themselves. While you're trying to dig through barbed wire, you're pretty exposed. Even tanks had difficulty getting through the barbed wire, and so we see these defenses built around these trenches really slow down the war. But the weapons of the war gain more effectiveness over the course of the war. So like machine guns at the beginning, which could fire 400 to 600 rounds a minute, required like 6 to 8 or 4 to 6 people to actually fire a machine gun. And more often than not, they overheated, which made it really hard for them to actually be used for long periods of time. But by 1918, enough new versions of the machine gun had come out that you now only needed one person to operate a machine gun. They were capable of firing twice as many rounds as they had been in 1914. Gas gets used on the Eastern Front first by Germany against Russia, although the air is too cold for the gas to be effective. And so the first effective use of gas in World War I is by Germany on the Western Front in France in the Second Battle of Ypres. There are over 91,000 deaths in World War I that are attributed to damages caused by gas. These large canisters would release a toxic gas that would, liquefy the lung, make it difficult to breathe, melt soft tissue, burn the face and eyes, and defending against gas became a major focus of the war. Here we have the town of Ypres before the second battle, and here we have a photo of it afterwards. You can see that not only was the fighting destructive to human lives, but also entire cities became rubble as a result. In part because of this heavy artillery that starts to become more and more effective throughout the war. We have a howitzer here that could fire a bullet the weight of a baby elephant about 6 miles, which is from Northwood High School to Woodbridge. And when that bullet hit the ground, it would detonate and explode. That became a main cause for a lot of the damage that we see throughout the war. We also see a bunch of innovation in trying to cross that no man's land between the trenches, including the invention of tanks, which first get used in 1915 as a way for British soldiers to cross the no man's land into the German trenches. It's really difficult to move a tank, especially through a bunch of mud, but they do start to make some progress along the Western Front. And then because this is a world war being fought outside of just France, we see a bunch of naval battles and Germany having to contend with the British Navy. And so the way that they decide to fight the British Navy is through U-boats or underwaterboats or submarines. We'll talk a little bit more about those in class. And airplanes start to get used in war. Although at the very beginning, they couldn't quite figure out the timing of the machine gun fire through the propeller, and so they would just arm the pilots with a pistol. Airplanes do start to be used for war, although they're mainly for reconnaissance, flying over enemy trench lines to take photos of the trenches, although they would have to dodge artillery fire and other things that tried to take them down, including enemy pilots who would fly straight at them. And along the lines of that innovation, we have Zeppelins, which are giant metal hydrogen-filled balloons. And then spy pigeons. They actually trained homing pigeons to wear cameras and fly over enemy trench lines and take pictures of the trenches and then return home. Which I think, it worked, and it also shows, I think, the level of invention and desperation that we see throughout the 4 years of World War I. World War I has long and bloody battles like the Battle of Verdun, pictured here, which was Germany pushing into France. It lasted 9 months, and in July, Germany has to kind of stop putting all of its effort into the Battle of Verdun in order to defend itself at the Battle of the Somme, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. And for that 9 months of fighting, we see 750,000 people die, and Germany pushing 5 miles into Allied territory. 9 months to cover 5 miles. At almost the same time, we have the Battle of the Somme, pictured here, which was an Allied offensive, so the Allies attacking into German territory. It lasted 6 months with an incredible casualty rate of 1.2 million people dead. And as a result of the 6 months of fighting, the Allies gain a whole 6 miles. So on one part of the Western Front, Germany pushes forward 5 miles, and in another part of the Western Front, the Allies push forward 6 miles, which means that there's a net gain for the Allies of 1 mile, and all it cost them was the better part of a year and 2 million people. So why did battles on the Western Front result in little territorial gain? And the correct answer here is B. The trench warfare really did make it difficult for soldiers to move the battle forward. Living in the trenches was pretty miserable. If you stood up ahead of the trenches, you were in line of machine gun fire or artillery fire or a potential sniper, and so your only option was to stay crouched for as long as you were at the front. And initially, soldiers were doing 12-hour stints at the front before they would be pulled back and someone else would come in to replace them. But by the end of the war, soldiers were spending weeks at the front before there was any sort of relief. So you're eating and sleeping and living in this dugout trench. Because you're eating and living and sleeping in this dugout trench, which is carved out of French countryside, you have to deal with things like rats, which got really big off of all of the waste. Soldiers would get rations in tins, like canned food, and when they would finish a meal, they would throw their cans into the no man's land between the enemy lines. And at night, it was said that you could hear the cans clinking together as the rats ran through all of the trash, turning it over, trying to eat all of the leftovers. There's several accounts of soldiers waking up at night to find that rats have started nibbling on them while they were still alive. And there are many accounts of soldiers coming upon a dead soldier only to find a rat somewhere inside the corpse making a meal of it. And because of this ready supply of food, these rats grew huge and carried a great deal of disease and illness. Just to put yourself into that perspective, rats were known for getting to rations before soldiers could. So if you were a soldier in World War I, would you eat your rations if they had been gnawed on by rats? What if you saw a fellow soldier get sick for eating rations that were gnawed on by rats? If you don't eat the rations that are gnawed on by rats, what do you eat? And do you go into battle without having had food? These are some difficult living conditions that soldiers had to deal with as a result, including the fact of trench foot, which I'm going to explain a little bit more, and then we'll go back to the picture of it. Nope, we'll just go there. Trench foot. So trenches are basically big gutters, and in France there's a lot of rain, and so you're standing in mud, and you can't get out of it, because to get out of the trench is to go over the top into no man's land, and that's where the machine guns are. And so you're standing in a gutter that's filled with mud, and if you've ever stayed in the bathtub or the pool too long and your skin starts to get pruny, it's like that, but for a really long time. And let's also add to it that mud is runoff water from no man's land, so it's through corpses and trash and latrines, which are the holes that you dig for your defecation, your bathroom time, and all of that murkiness combining into the liquid that you have to stand in for days on end, sleep in, live in. And that would cause a condition known as trench foot, where the soft tissues would literally start to melt away from the bone. And the only option, once that had started to happen, was amputation. And so we see amputations become a much more common thing as a result of World War I, which leads a lot of artists to get involved in prosthetic making, as they want to be supportive of the war but don't have the skill for war. Artists enlist themselves in making prosthetics for the soldiers as they return home. Here we see 3 different soldiers impacted. The first one, he took a bullet or a piece of shrapnel to his face, and he had a prosthetic eye placement so that it looked like he had a whole face. The other two are both casualties of that gas that we talked about being used by both sides, and that chemical gas would melt soft tissues, and so artists created whole fake faces for people to wear so that they could go about society without having to deal with the stares from their disfigurement as a result of the war. Not all wounds were external, and a condition that gets called shell shock in World War I becomes a really common experience for soldiers, especially when they start to return home. They have a really difficult time feeling safe, and today we call it PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, where nowhere feels safe, and soldiers wake up, crying. There's several accounts of soldiers not being able to go to the movies because sitting indoors for that long just doesn't feel safe. There's a lot of accounts of soldiers not being able to sleep on their beds or sleep in rooms alone. And shell shock becomes a really difficult thing for countries to deal with as their soldiers come home physically appearing uninjured, but unable to reintegrate into the lives that they had before they went off to war. Which of the following was a hardship that soldiers had to face in the trenches? The cat's weighing in. Select all that apply. Yes. Yeah, oh, I know. What she's telling you is that the correct answer is A, B, and D. Bonding with fellow soldiers is not considered a hardship, although it is definitely something that soldiers did, as they spent a lot of time just sitting and waiting in the trenches. So talking about more than just the soldiers' experience, women during the war took on new roles, especially in war production and agriculture. We see women here. We've got photos of women in the Red Cross defending or helping to support wounded soldiers in the front. And on the home front, so the people who didn't go off to war, who stayed at home, we see women taking on traditionally male jobs during the war. In Germany, by 1917, women made up 30% of the military production in the workforce. But women took on jobs from mechanics to ammunition testers to switchboard operators to stock takers. There was a lot of jobs left unfilled as more and more men were called off to war, and the women stepped up to fill in those roles. And this is something that we would call total war, which is a war where all of the resources of a country are dedicated towards the war effort. And so here we have a photo of 3 women who are in a factory that I think made sewing machines before the war. But during the war, the government asked the factory to switch its production from sewing machines to munitions. So those are huge rounds that they're building in their factory. In the square brown photo, we have the Boy Scouts of America collecting scrap metal to be sent off to support the Allies in the war, as the Allies needed any sort of metal so they could melt it down for bullets, and tin campaigns or scrap metal campaigns became popular during the war. And then we have a recruitment poster where we're talking about the roles that women get to play. Although both the British and the U.S. Navy end up having officer roles for women called yeomen during World War I, where they take on a lot of communication roles within the war. Our final question. Zeppelins, those big helium or hydrogen-filled balloons, they don't get used in the trenches so commonly, in large part because it's a giant hydrogen balloon floating over a bunch of heavy artillery, and if you hit the giant hydrogen balloon, it explodes in a horrific fire and then rains balloon parts down all over the trenches. And so it's not super effective in trench warfare, but Germany ends up using Zeppelins to bomb civilian cities, especially in Britain, where they send in these giant, slow-moving balloons, and then in the basket beneath them, soldiers would push out bombs, specifically fire bombs, that would land onto, like, London, and cause mass destruction for civilians. And that wasn't seen as being a attack on civilians, because of total war, civilians are, it's dinner time and the sun has gone down, which is why it's now dark, and she's yelling. Okay. Civilians, regardless of what job they had, were helping their country prepare for the war. And then that's what happens with total war. When all of your resources are committed to the war effort, even the Boy Scouts of America are supporting the Allies. And so attacking, any of these civilian factories or homes, you're actually helping your side, because those civilians in those homes work in jobs that support the war effort. And so the less of them there are, the weaker your enemy becomes. And so my question to you is, of all of the new weapons that we see in World War I, why is it that Zeppelins end up being used so frequently in propaganda posters? Zeppelins aren't the most used weapon in World War I. They're not the most deadly. So why is it that they become the focus of a lot of propaganda, like these two examples that we have here? That's it. You made it. I'm proud of you. I'll see you in class.